God bless America. Hello, everybody. I am the Talk Radio Protege. This is the Protege program. Thank you so much for joining me. I know that you are here because you clicked on the video titled Chris Cuomo Comes to the Defense of Antifa, but I want to begin with just a brief discussion, some brief coverage of Omarosa's, what did I say? Call it a smear campaign / book tour. So, Entertainment Weekly has reviewed her book. They titled their review, Marks a New Peak in Disgrace. And I guess they give these books a grade. They gave it a D+. I'm assuming that's a pretty low rating. They made some observations like Omarosa's new book it is not valuable for anything except for the dirt that it has on Trump. And some of the other phrasings that they use throughout this review makes me think that they're not a Trump-friendly publication. So I think it's interesting that a adversarial publication would think so lowly of a book that's supposed to be damaging to the president. Another thing that I wanted to point out on Omarosa's book, you might remember in yesterday's video, I said that I don't think this book is going to do anything. I think it's just going to fizzle out. And Entertainment Weekly has made a couple of similar observations, how this book is kind of tracking like two other books that came out, that have come out in the past year. And I can't remember the first guy's name, but maybe it was Michael Wolff that wrote the first book that was supposed to be really explosive and a bombshell revelation. They point to James Comey's book, and now they're pointing to Omarosa's and saying it's just the third book of the trilogy. It's just another one in the line. It's not going to do anything. And I think that one indication that this book is not going to lead to anything substantial as far as anti-Trump sentiment goes is the big bombshell claim from Omarosa's book about the N-word has absolutely no verification whatsoever. From this Fox News column, nobody that they cite is able to verify that a tape exists of Trump saying the N-word. The two people that Omarosa claims to have heard the tape are herself, or maybe it was three people, herself, Frank Luntz, and one other individual. Herself is unreliable because you can't verify your own claims. Frank Luntz has come out and said he's never heard the tape. The other person who Omarosa claims has heard the tape has also claimed to have never heard the tape. So she has no verification for her biggest bombshell claim. It's kind of like the dossier. The big bombshell claim of the dossier remains unverified to this day. Now, let's get right along to the main reason why you come to the video today. CNN star Chris Cuomo accused of defending Antifa in monologue. Now, Fox News records the biggest, juiciest pieces of the monologue, and that's what I want to talk about today. Let's begin with reading a couple of paragraphs from the Fox News story. CNN star Chris Cuomo is under fire for a monologue that some critics have interpreted as defending Antifa after the militant group harassed police and members of the media during a chaotic weekend of protests against white supremacists. On Monday's edition of Cuomo Primetime, the CNN host referred to quote-unquote counter-protesters and said that, quote, the vast majority of them were peaceful, end quote, with the exception of some members of Antifa who, quote, covered their faces, confronted police, and berated journalists, end quote. Cuomo condemned their actions as wrong, but argued that all punches are not equal in a monologue that has angered critics of the CNN host. Now, I want to stop for a moment and point out that Chris Cuomo is technically correct when he says all punches are not equal. There's something that I haven't spent a lot of time on. I think I've mentioned it in videos gone by, but the truth is the truth, no matter whose mouth it comes out of. So when Chris Cuomo says all punches are not equal, that's technically true. He may not be thinking of it in this way, but he's technically true. Punches thrown in defense of one's life from a bona fide threat are justified. at least as society, we've decided that retaliating with force in defense of one's own life, and in many cases in defense of property as well, that's a justified use of force, and other punches are not. So if you think about it, Chris Cuomo is right when he says that all punches are not equal. If someone, when an aggressor's punches are not just, but a retaliatory punch, a punch thrown in defense of one's life, is just. So just keep that in mind. If the phrase "all punches are not equal" angers you, just remember, self-defense, violence in self-defense is just according to American law and in accordance with the right to life and the right to preservation of life. So just keep that in mind as we're moving through parts of this story. Let's go down to the next paragraph. And this paragraph is mostly quotes from Cuomo. If you're a punk who comes and starts trouble in a mask and hurt people, you're not about any virtuous cause. You're just somebody who's going to be held to the standard of doing something wrong. And Cuomo gets it right in that first sentence. Now let's continue to read. But when someone comes to call out bigots and it gets hot, even physical, are they equally wrong as the bigot they are fighting? I argue no. Now that's an argument that we can make, and I intend to somewhat hash that out in this video. But let's talk about this. Think about it in practical terms. Sometimes two grown people, we'll just say men, it's usually men that are getting into these fist fights, right? Sometimes two grown men go to a bar and get in a fist fight. Maybe they don't get in a fist fight at a bar. Maybe they get in a fist fight somewhere else. And everybody that watches agrees that the two guys might not be just in what they're doing, but it's just a brawl. They are hurting each other. There's not really any reason to go any farther than this fist fight. Now, if somebody gets severely injured, then we might need to go a little bit farther as far as getting the law involved. But two guys just box in the street or a bar or wherever, and there's no real damage beyond bruised fists and egos, then there's not really any other problem. That's what I think Cuomo might be trying to talk about when he says, when someone comes to call out bigots and it gets hot, even physical, are they equally wrong? That would be like, let's go back to the bar fight example. Two guys are, maybe they're a little inebriated, and one guy says to the other, your mama, or, whatever. One guy says, your mom's ugly, or, some other insult. And the other guy responds by throwing a punch, and thus a bar fight breaks out. Now, was it right of the first guy to say, your mom is ugly? Well, it's rude. It's probably, it's impolite. He is within his right to free speech to say, your mom is ugly. But he's not a nice guy. People aren't going to look at that guy and say, you didn't have that punch coming. But that doesn't mean that the guy that threw the first punch is just in retaliating against words with violence. So both parties are in the wrong, let's say. Especially if the second guy then punches back, responds to this violence with more violence. The situation gets escalated. This all began with an insult, and then it devolved into a brawl. So people are going to look at that situation and say, neither one of those guys is necessarily a good guy, but I understand why you punched him. So that's what I think. I'm trying to be generous here. I think being generous, we can look at what Chris Cuomo is saying and say, yeah, I understand what he's saying. I'm not going to use any choice words for obvious reasons, but let's say that a white nationalist or a white supremacist says black people are expletives, and somebody, maybe it's a black guy, maybe it's a white guy, whatever, somebody comes up and says, you are a bad person for saying that. And so the white supremacist continues to tirade, and the other person gets upset, and they throw a punch. Now, the white supremacist is within his right to freedom of speech in saying bad things about black people. But that doesn't make him a good person. And people are going to look at the white supremacist and say, we understand why you got punched in the face. We don't agree that you should have been punched in the face for the words that you've said, but we understand why. The guy that punched you is not just in punching you, but we understand why he punched you. Now, that is one situation. That's what Chris Cuomo, I think, is talking about. If I'm being generous. If I'm not being generous, then Chris Cuomo is saying anybody who disagrees with him is a bigot and deserves to be punched. That's the disingenuous way to interpret these statements, and I think a lot of people are taking the disingenuous interpretation. We'll see some of those tweets down below. Now, let's keep tracking this. Keep hunting this down. Let's run it out to the end. Chris Cuomo says that when someone comes to call out the bigots, are they equally wrong as the bigot they are fighting? Now, I say it depends. Let's say that somebody is talking. Let's take the labels away. Somebody is talking, and you disagree with them, so you go up and punch them. You're obviously in the wrong. Words do not elicit violence. That's just not the right thing to do. You know, we think about it from this way. You know, it's illegal to intimidate a witness in a criminal in a trial. But at the same time, if a person who is trying to intimidate a witness, it's very easy to mask your intimidation in language that is arguable in court. You know, if a mobster says to a witness against him, "That's a beautiful daughter you have. I would hate for something to happen to her," you know, that's arguably not a threat. But to the guy who's a witness, he very clearly understands that that's a threat against his life. So that's kind of the ground on which we're arguing. When Chris Cuomo says, or when Antifa, I guess is more appropriate, when Antifa says words are violence, they are saying white supremacists are threatening black people when they call black people expletives, or I hesitate to voice the insult, but I think you know what I'm driving at. And it's kind of understandable where that comes from, because threats can be veiled in such a way that the person who is meant to be threatened can very clearly understand where the threat is coming from. Do you get what I'm saying? Am I making sense to you? Maybe I shouldn't get too hung up on this point. But one other thing that I want to point out here is that nobody is saying that Antifa and a white supremacist are equally wrong. If a white supremacist is saying racist things and he gets punched by a member of Antifa, nobody is saying that the white supremacist and the member of Antifa are equally wrong. What we are saying is that they are both in the wrong. The racist person is saying things that a very small percentage of the population agrees with, less than 1%. They are in the wrong in that their ideas are wrong. The Antifa fellow that throws a punch is in the wrong in that he has illegally attacked a person who has committed no crime. That is where we are saying both of these people are in the wrong. What Chris Cuomo, being generous, that is what Chris Cuomo is saying. What some people are saying when they point to these incidences and say that, now, hold on, that's not what I want to say. Now, I think that Chris Cuomo hears the right-wing media attacking Antifa, and he thinks, hold on a second, there's another side of the equation here. There's all these bigots and white supremacists and evil people that are saying mean things and racist things and bad things. They deserve some comeuppance. And Antifa is just delivering that comeuppance in the form of physical violence. So they're not equal in Chris Cuomo's mind. Now, they're not equal in anybody else's mind, I don't think. But nobody is saying... But when it comes to coverage of these events, you know, people say that there were white supremacists at this rally, and then Antifa is punching those people. And it's kind of taken, I think, that Chris Cuomo is not taking it for granted that people believe white supremacists are wrong. And when he reads media coverage, or he hears media coverage that says, a white supremacist was punched by Antifa was in the wrong, he thinks these people clearly don't see that white supremacists are in the wrong. And I don't think that he's right in making that assumption. Now, I might be getting off in the weeds a little bit here. Something else that I want to point out, and I think we're going to get to it. You know what? I'll save that point. I'm going to stick a pin in it. We'll come back to that point in a moment. Let's move along, and we're going to read some of the responses that Cuomo has gotten from this monologue. Media Research Center analyst Christine Marsh wrote, Cuomo started off by placidly arguing that violence is violence and attacks on the media were simply wrong. But eventually, he tried to justify the violence coming from the left because, according to him, these rioters had the moral upper hand. Now, that's something I think there's a little bit of a disconnect here, a little bit of a miscommunication. See, the violence that Chris Cuomo is specifically trying to elevate or downplay in its wrongness is when Antifa attacks white supremacists. I don't think that Chris Cuomo is trying to downplay Antifa violence against journalists and the police, because he specifically says that when Antifa attacks bigots, that Antifa and bigots are not equally wrong. That's what he's specifically calling out. I don't think that he is saying that when Antifa attacks journalists, that Antifa is not as bad as bigots. He's trying to draw the connection between Antifa and the bigots and saying these two people aren't the same. He hasn't commented, at least in the monologue excerpts that we've seen so far, on Antifa violence against journalists and police. Mediaite covered the rant with a headline, Chris Cuomo defends Antifa by saying their attacks on police journalists are not equal to bigots. Now, that's a little bit disingenuous. Remember, let's go back and look at this paragraph. When someone comes to call out bigots, and it gets hot, even physical, are they equally wrong as the bigot they are fighting? Chris Cuomo is saying when Antifa attacks a bigot, then Antifa is not wrong in the same degree as the bigot. I think that it's a little bit, it's reading a little bit too much in between the lines to say that Chris Cuomo is calling journalists or media members and the police bigots. At least in this paragraph. He's probably I wouldn't be surprised if he's called police bigots in the past, but at least in this monologue, he hasn't done that. Now, it's probably important that I stop here and say that I'm not a fan of Chris Cuomo. Chris Cuomo gets plenty wrong, and I think that even in his commentary on these events here, he's getting it a little bit wrong. But it's reading too much between the lines to say what some of the backlash has been saying that we've read thus far. The Hill media reporter Joe Concha wrote that Cuomo defended Antifa and reminded readers that the CNN host once compared Allied troops who stormed the beaches of Normandy on D-Day to modern-day Antifa members with a message on Twitter. Now, I think that is I think that's a fair criticism, that Cuomo is defending Antifa while they are attacking journalists. He's trying to separate Antifa. He's trying to downplay their violence against bigots while Antifa is attacking journalists and police officers, and it's an untimely defense. I think that's a fair criticism. Daily Wire reporter Ryan, I'm sorry, Ryan, I like the organization you work for, but I don't know how to pronounce your name. Cuomo suggested on Monday night that violence carried out by Antifa is not as bad as violence committed by racists because Antifa's violence is moral and just. Now, again, in the specific monologue that Chris Cuomo gave Monday night, if we're being a little bit generous, he is specifically saying that violence against bigots is not the same as bigots being hateful. Let's go ahead and skip on down to some of Cuomo responding on Twitter. Cuomo was also criticized on Twitter, where he responded forcefully. Amazing how partisanship is driving the right to embrace even hate groups. Now, again, this is Chris Cuomo misinterpreting some of the criticism. So there's miscommunication going on both ways, and I think the miscommunication is only in the receiving of information. I think that some of the commentary that sounds like it's coming from the right wing is misinterpretation of what Chris said, and what Chris is about to say is misinterpretation of what his critics have been saying. So let's continue. Nobody from the right is embracing hate groups. People are simply not happy with Chris Cuomo defending Antifa under any circumstance, specifically in this incident where his defense comes on the heels of Antifa attacking journalists and police officers. Of course, Antifa or anyone attacking cops and media in name of any cause are wrong and criminal. See, he knows what, now he might not know that he didn't make it clear in his monologue, but he knows why he's being attacked for defending Antifa here. And so he's going to try and clarify with this statement. But to expand the argument to all who oppose bigotry are the same as hateful bigots. Come on. So now, see, this is why I'm saying that, Chris Cuomo is not saying that Antifa is just in the violence that they perform. He is just saying Antifa's violence is not as bad as the white supremacist rhetoric. And I think that's an argument that can be had. And I think I've stated it a little bit thus far, how the freedom of speech is something that we prize in Western society, and violence to shut down speech is not generally accepted. On the mainstream left, it's becoming more accepted, but societally as a whole, much less so. Let's read one more, and then I'm going to call it, because I've spent quite a bit of time talking about this so far. Pundit Joel Pollack accused Cuomo of siding with Antifa and excusing violence on the left, but the CNN host fired back. This is bogus, why spread lies? And luckily the video is there for all to see. When Antifa people hit cops, they lose legal and moral high ground. I am talking about people like you who say bigots and those opposing them are equal. So again, Chris has been pretty consistent throughout this argument, throughout the monologue that he delivered Monday night and the responses that he's delivered so far on Twitter. He doesn't see an equivalence between people saying racist things and people punching people saying racist things. And I don't think that the people on the right see an equivalence either. I think that is an equivalence, or I think that's an accusation that Cuomo is making that is incorrect. But And again, I'm no fan of Cuomo. In his defense, he is calling out Antifa for the violence they've perpetrated against media members, journalists, and the police. And the argument that he is making is that he doesn't see racist, bigoted speech as on the same level as violence perpetrated by Antifa against the people that are making racist, bigoted speech. That's all that I'm saying. Now, we've been going on for plenty of time, so I'm going to call it there. The story is there for you to continue reading if you like. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments down below. I think that this is an interesting discussion that could be had here, so I'm looking forward to those comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed. Leave a like if you did. Hit subscribe and hit the bell for notifications so that you don't miss future videos. Thank you again for joining me. I hope that you'll come back next time. Until then, good night and God bless.